So the senior cop in the Deane manslaughter case got 5 years in prison. The other 2 cops each got 3-year sentences, but those sentences have been suspended. Deane's mom is very disappointed with the sentencing. What do you think? I'm Deane Miller. Thank you so much for joining me. Time for tea. Deane was beaten to death while in police custody in 2014. Now, Corporal Elaine Stewart, the most senior of 3 police officers who was convicted in connection with Mario's death, has been sentenced to 5 years in prison for manslaughter, 1 year for misconduct in a public office, 1 year for attempting to pervert the course of justice. Those sentences are supposed to run concurrently, meaning they're all running at the same time. So it's the longest one you look at, that's the 5 years. She's appealing though, so she was given bail pending the appeal. Now, the other 2 police constables, Juliana Clevon and Marlon Grant, each got 3 years for manslaughter and 1 year for misconduct in a public office. Those sentences have been suspended though, meaning they don't go to prison unless during the period that the sentences are suspended, they commit some other offense. In that case, they would go to prison. Now, as I mentioned, Deane's mother, Mercia Fraser, is very disappointed, saying she feels as if her son's life doesn't mean anything. She said she expected more. So I spent several hours interviewing Miss Fraser after the cops had been found guilty. She's a wonderful woman. I have huge respect for her. From the time her son was killed in 2014, she fought for justice for him. You know, she led demonstrations. She kept speaking up. When the case looked as if it was never going to start, she was instrumental in keeping the issue in the public domain. And now she feels that fight was in vain. It was not in vain. She did get justice for her son, right? The fact that there were convictions for 3 police in this matter, that's actually a big deal. DPP Paula Llewellyn, a career prosecutor, told me that she in fact cannot remember ever seeing police being convicted in this kind of case. She said it was a very difficult case to prosecute, and also she said the prosecution did ask for heavier sentences, but she said she won't appeal because the sentences aren't unduly lenient. They may be lenient, not unduly lenient, not too lenient, not so far out that she would have to appeal them. Now, in this case, the cops had been convicted of what is called gross negligence manslaughter. So they weren't accused of having beaten Mario to death, right? They were accused of not doing their job, not doing what they should have done, which would have been to give the man bail because he was entitled to bail after they arrested him for a ganja spliff, and also they put him in a cell with violent mentally ill inmates. Now, when judges are sentencing, they're guided by what are called the sentencing guidelines. They not just make up the number them out of thin air. Those guidelines tell you the usual point at which a judge should start calculating the sentence. So in the case of manslaughter, the starting point usually is 7 years. So the judge going says, all right, we start at 7 years. Then they add on some years for what they call aggravating factors, meaning those that make the situation worse, make the offense worse. And then they subtract for what they call mitigating circumstances that should lighten the sentence. For instance, mitigating circumstances, if you're of good character, if you haven't had any previous criminal conviction. In this case, we heard one of the mitigating circumstances was that the inmates themselves said, apart from the Mario situation, the police actually treated them pretty well. So after the judges go through that particular exercise, right, they start at the starting point, they add on some years, they take off some years, they end up with an end result which is supposed to be within what is called the sentencing range. And in the case of manslaughter, that's anywhere generally from 3 years to 15 years. I'm not going to comment much on these sentences, and that's because I wasn't in court myself. I always like to hear for myself what the judge said and how the judge calculates a particular sentence. In this case, the sentencing process took quite a while, and I'm told he went into a lot of detail again because I wasn't there. I'm not going to comment much. I would say, though, this was an absolutely disgraceful case. It will easily, I think, go down in history as one of the worst cases in which somebody was killed while in police custody. So here's the thing though, and I think this is something we can change. I think one of the problems we have is that we need to manage the public's expectations better. When the family and the public hear about this kind of situation, because somebody died, Mario is dead, and they hear manslaughter and they hear a conviction, they're looking probably to hear something like 20 years, 30 years, whatever. And that's not going to happen, not under the sentencing guidelines for manslaughter. So I think we need to educate people more. We need to talk to them more ahead of time and explain, for instance, what the sentencing range is for a particular offense, so people don't have inflated expectations of what the sentence could be and then end up really disappointed. But honestly, I totally understand why people would feel vexed and feel that suspended sentences in a case like this just could not be appropriate. Let me remind you in greater detail what happened in this case. The Gleaner at the time had spoken to Marcia Fraser, that's Mario's mom, right? And she told them that he had a terrible chop over his left eye, one on the top of his head, a mark on his left arm, a bruise under his chin. She said his face was swollen, his eyes were swollen so you couldn't even see his eyelashes, and his head was twice the size it was before he was beaten. Ms. Fraser also told the Gleaner that when the police took him to the hospital, they told the doctors that he had fallen off a bunk bed, but they told the family he had been beaten by his cellmates. According to Ms. Fraser, it was about 10:30 the Sunday morning that she got a call from her son, that's Mario, that the police had arrested him for a ganja spliff and he was at the Barnett Street police station, and he asked his mother to tell a friend to go down there and bail him. Shortly after midday, his friend, Castell Mackenzie, went to the Barnett Street police station in Montego Bay with the documents, ready to bail him, right? Mackenzie told the Gleaner that when he went to the police station, Mario had been taken out of the cell and was being processed to be released. While they were talking, Mario said he didn't like the police, and the one police who was dealing with the documents said she didn't like what he said, gave Mackenzie back the bail papers and said she was going to keep him locked up for an additional 2 hours, so he should come back at 5 p.m. Mackenzie said instead of waiting till 5 p.m. he went back at 3, and when he got there he was told that Mario Deane had been taken to the Cornwall Regional Hospital. Knowing he had left him just 2 hours earlier in perfectly good health, he said he was perplexed and he started to ask what had happened. He said the police told him that Mario had been beaten up by other prisoners. But he said when he went to the hospital and saw him, he said it was clear his injuries didn't come from punches. Nicholas Deane, that's Mario's father, had told the Gleaner on Tuesday, that would have been 2 days after he was arrested, that he didn't want to stand by and watch his son die for a mere ganja spliff. He said he doubted a spliff would attract more than 100 fine in the court, and he's quite right. Because when I used to cover court, I can tell you, every Monday morning, you used to have this string of young men brought into court in Montego Bay, having been arrested over the weekend for ganja spliff. And yes, they would be fined $100, everybody go their yard. So Mr. Deane was quite right. The Gleaner said that Mario's mom was crying openly for her only son and said she would fight for justice for him. And importantly, she said he was in the care of the government, and that is such an important point. Now, an autopsy took place about a month later, and the pathologist said based on the severity of the injuries that he saw, Mario could never have survived what must have been a vicious beating that he received while in custody at the Barnett Street police station. He also said that the initial report from the police that Mario Deane had fallen from a bunk bed or was thrown from a bunk bed was clearly not true. He also had a problem with the condition of the cell Mario had been put into, saying it is bad, unconscionably small. It does not permit 5 adults to reside in this cramped cell with 5 concrete beds without bedding, just hard concrete. It would not be permitted, he said, in the US. He said it's guaranteed to cause problems, and he also took exception to the fact that Mario had been put in a cell with mentally ill persons, exposing him to unnecessary danger, saying he should have been put in a separate cell, especially since he was about to be released. Now, I should tell you, you hear this, and if anybody remembers the Agana Barrett situation, you flash right back to that. Agana Barrett was a man who years ago suffocated in a cell at the Constant Spring lockup, right? And another time I do a whole thing about Agana Barrett, because that's another story that we should never ever forget. Kudos to Maria's mother, Miss Fraser, and everybody who stood with her for over 10 years, making sure Jamaica never forgot this one. Always bringing to public attention what was happening and what was not happening in relation to this case. Over 10 years to get a conviction for somebody who was killed in 2014. I do have to say there were COVID delays in that time frame that couldn't be avoided, but we still need to do better. When you hear Maria's mother saying she thought she would never be able to get justice for Mario in Jamaica, the whole of it's supposed to shame. Now, this was a proper beating. This is what the forensic pathologist said at the trial as reported by the Star. He said Mario suffered a fractured skull, bleeding in the brain, internal injuries in the mouth and throat. He said Mario had swallowed some of his own blood into his lungs, leading to choking that contributed to his death. He said the cause of death, in summary, was severe blunt force injury to the head, resulting in a broken skull bone and bleeding in the brain, in association with manual strangulation of the neck, resulting in damage and bleeding in the neck and lack of oxygen. He said the injuries suggested Mario had been held down and hit against blunt surfaces during his beating. He had a total of 19 external injuries, including bruises consistent with finger marks on his arms and the back of his neck, and blunt force injuries on his head, shoulders, and waist. Now, 3 inmates were charged for the killing of Mario Deane, right? One of them, Damien Cargill, was found to suffer from schizophrenia. It was found that he didn't have the mental capacity to stand trial. The linguistics expert said in the report that Mr. Cargill is unable to produce human language, that he does not have the expressive and receptive skills of a native English or patois speaker, that communicating with him on areas unrelated to basic daily activities is not possible. Now, in 2018, the other 2 were found fit to stand trial, and in July 2020, almost 6 years after Mario Deane was beaten in police custody and died, the other 2 men, Marvin Orr and Adrian Morgan, pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the St. James Circuit Court. The judge sentenced them to 5 years and 6 months in prison, but they were set free immediately because they had already served that time. The whole story about mentally ill people and our justice system need a whole video, or probably a whole set of videos of its own. Another time for that. So you may be wondering, hold on, if it's the inmates who beat him and they were convicted, how police come into it? How come police were charged? Corporal Elaine Stewart, District Constable Marlon Grant, and District Constable Juliana Clevon had been arrested by Indicom on charges of manslaughter, perverting the course of justice, and misconduct in a public office. This is what Indicom said at the time about the charges. They say Elaine Stewart willfully neglected to perform her duty, right? In that, without reasonable explanation or excuse, she refused to complete the processing of Mario Deane's bail, and that was an abuse of the public trust. So Indicom says Stewart, Grant, and Clevon failed to properly assess and monitor the risk of harm to Mario Deane. Also, that they failed to preserve the conditions of the cell where Mario Deane had been injured. Stewart was said with intent to pervert the course of public justice, had caused the cell where Deane had been beaten to be cleaned before the investigators could get there. So in summary, they never finished processing the bail. They didn't assess the risk of putting him in the cell with those inmates, and also the cleaning of the cell before the investigators got there. The manslaughter charge, now this is what is called gross negligence manslaughter, meaning that Mario died because of the grossly negligent behavior of the 3 police. Grossly negligent means very, 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 very negligent. They never do what them did supposed to do. Finally, the trial started. March 2025, and then this guilty verdict, May 2025, more than 10 years after Mario Deane had been taken into police custody and ended up dead. Honestly, this is one of the episodes in Jamaican history we must never forget, that we should feel ashamed of, that we should try to ensure is never repeated. Alright, so that's where I have to leave it. As always, like the video, share it with somebody you think might be interested, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. And of course, click that notification bell so you know anytime I drop a new video. I'm Deane. Thanks so much for watching. Back to tea.